Nora Calloway ran the side pole test twice because she couldn't believe the first number. 312 millimeters of intrusion. That's the door pillar folding inward, into the exact space where a driver's chest goes. Not a fender, not a mirror, a chest. She stood in the observation bay at the Delray Park test facility, and she watched the slow-motion replay 4 times. And the pillar came in like a fist every single time. She didn't panic. She didn't call anyone. She got out her pen, and she wrote the number down. 2 days after she wrote it down, her VP slid the report back across his desk. Same report, same test. Only now the failing number had been quietly rewritten as a pass. She looked at it, and she looked at him, and he said, "Numbers are a negotiation." Nora, 48 hours after that, security walked her across the open floor, past 40 coworkers who found something very interesting to look at on their own desks. Deactivated badge. A cardboard box with a dead plant and a coffee mug in it. 14 years, out the front door in under 4 minutes. They took my badge. They took my references. They made me sign for a box of my own things on the way out. What they forgot, what a man that arrogant never even thinks about, is where I filed everything. For 14 years. If you've ever been punished for refusing to do something wrong, if you've ever been the only one in the room who said no and paid for it, this story is for you. Before I go on, do me one small thing. Subscribe so you're here when the emails come back. And comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Go ahead, I'll wait. Now let me tell you how it actually happened. It happened in Rundle, Michigan. A flat, honest town. The kind where the biggest building for 40 miles is the one that makes the thing everybody drives. Halcyon Meridian Automotive. The test facility sat out on the county road, a low-grade complex behind 2 fences, and everybody in Rundle knew somebody who worked there. Nora Calloway had worked there for 14 years. She was a senior crash safety validation engineer. Say that title out loud, and it sounds like a lot. What it meant, day to day, was that Nora was the person who made sure the car wouldn't kill you. That was the whole job. Somebody designed the car to look good and cost little. Somebody else built it to a schedule. And then it came to Nora, and Nora ran it into a wall on purpose and measured what happened to the crash test dummy sitting where a human being was going to sit. She was good at it. Better than good. In 14 years, she had caught things that other people missed. And she had caught them because she looked at the number even when the number was inconvenient. Especially when it was inconvenient. There's a certain kind of engineer who trusts the data over the mood in the room. Nora was that kind. She used to say the data doesn't have a boss and it doesn't have a launch date. The data just tells you the truth, and your only job is to write it down. That belief was her strength. It was also, though she didn't know it yet, the exact soft place where all of this would go in. Because being right and being liked are 2 different jobs, and Nora only ever knew how to do the first one. Twice she'd been up for promotion. Twice she'd been passed over. And both times, if you cornered someone from the 4th floor and made them be honest. The reason was the same. Nora flags problems. Nora finds the thing you were hoping nobody would find, 3 weeks before launch, when finding it costs money. Nora says the uncomfortable no. You don't promote the person who says no. You promote the person who says, "We'll make it work." She told herself she didn't mind. Mostly she believed it. She had a daughter, Lucy, 17, a senior, sharp as a tack and twice as fast with her mouth. It was Lucy's whole life mission, more or less, to be unimpressed by her mother's job. Mom crashes cars for a living. She'd tell people, deadpan, on purpose. With the government's permission. And a couple of years back, for a birthday, Lucy had given her a keychain, a tiny plastic crash test dummy, the little yellow and black figure with the circle and cross target on its face. Lucy had named it Buckle. "For your dummies," Lucy said. So one of them finally makes it out alive. Nora clipped Buckle to her badge lanyard the day she got it, and it rode there every single day after. Little yellow dummy, swinging against her chest when she walked. Some of the younger techs thought it was corny. Nora thought it was the best thing she owned. Every morning she badged in, and Buckle knocked against the reader. And she thought about the fact that behind every test number was a real family in a real car on a real road. Buckle kept the number from ever becoming just a number. Keep your eye on that little dummy. It's going to travel further than anyone in that building would ever have guessed. The car that started everything was called the Vero, a compact SUV. The kind of vehicle a young family buys because it's affordable and it looks safe, and the ads show it full of soccer gear and golden retrievers. That was the whole point of the Vero. Affordable, that word did a lot of quiet, dangerous work. Because affordable means cheap, and cheap means light. And light means you take steel out of the car. And the place you take steel out of, if you're not careful, if the schedule is screaming and the launch date is locked, is the structure. The bones. The parts nobody sees. They were weeks out from launch. The Vero line was built, the marketing was booked, the dealers were waiting. And there was one last thing standing between the Vero and the American road. And that one last thing was a validation test in Nora Calloway's bay. The side pole impact. It simulates the worst kind of crash there is, the car sliding sideways into a telephone pole or a tree. All that force focused on one narrow point, right at the driver's door. Sam Rhee ran it. Sam was 29, a junior test technician, careful and quiet and honest to a fault. He set the rig, he checked it twice, he checked it a third time because Nora was watching, and he wanted to get it right. The sled fired. The Vero slammed into the pole at 32 kilometers an hour, and the high-speed cameras caught all of it, frame by terrible frame. The pillar folded, not bent. Folded, it came into the cabin, and it kept coming, right into the dummy's chest cavity. And when the sensor settled, the number on the screen was 312. 312 millimeters of intrusion. The survival threshold, the line past which a real belted human being suffers catastrophic, life-ending chest injury, was 250. They weren't a hair over. They weren't 10 millimeters over. They were 62 millimeters past the line where a person stops walking away. Sam went very still. He looked at the screen, and then he looked at Nora, and he said, quietly, "That's not a sensor error." It wasn't a question. He'd run the rig himself. He knew. Nora didn't say anything for a moment. She reset the test and ran it again, fresh dummy, fresh rig, everything clean, because that's what you do. You make certain. And it came in at 312 again. Same fist, same pillar, same dead space where a father's chest would be. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a bad weld or a loose bolt. Nora pulled the structural spec that night, and she saw it in the numbers. The body pillar on the Vero was undergauged, thinner metal than the physics needed. Somebody, somewhere up the chain, had shaved the steel to hit a weight target, and a weight target is a cost target, and the cost target had quietly written a death into the design. She didn't panic. I want you to notice that about her, because it matters later. She got out her pen, and she wrote the number down, and she wrote down what it meant in plain English, so that no one could ever pretend they didn't understand it. Then she went home, and she sat in her kitchen, in the dark, and she thought about the families who were 3 weeks away from putting their kids in that car. The next morning, she took it up the chain. That's what the process is for. That's what she believed, all the way down to the bone, that the process protects the honest. You find the problem, you report the problem, the system fixes the problem. That's the deal. That's why the process exists. She would find out, over the next several weeks, exactly what the process was worth to the men who ran it. Grant Whitfield was the VP of Vehicle Safety Engineering. 55 years old, silver hair, good suits, the kind of firm handshake they teach you at a leadership retreat. He'd been at Halcyon Meridian his whole career, and he was 2 steps from the top. The Vero launch was his launch. Hit the date, and the word in the building was that Grant Whitfield was going to be the next chief operating officer. Missed the date, and he was the man who blew a launch that everyone in Detroit was watching. So when Nora Calloway walked into his office with a 312 in her hand, she wasn't bringing him a safety finding. She was bringing him a bomb with his own name on the timer. She didn't understand that yet. She thought she was bringing him the truth. And she thought the truth would be welcome, because that was the whole point of her job. He was pleasant about it. That was the first thing that told her something was wrong, how pleasant he was. He didn't argue the number. He didn't call it a fluke. He leaned back and he steepled his fingers and he asked her, gently, if she'd consider revisiting the assumptions. Revisit the assumptions, Nora said. The test conditions, Whitfield said. The rig setup, the boundary parameters. You know as well as I do, Nora, that a validation test carries a lot of assumptions, and reasonable people can set those assumptions differently. I'm just asking you to rerun it under fair conditions. That's all. Fair conditions. It was so smooth, she almost didn't catch it. Almost, but Nora had run 10,000 tests, and she knew there was no assumption on Earth that turned a 312 into a pass. The pillar folded into the chest. You could set the boundary conditions any reasonable way you liked, and the pillar still folded into the chest. What he was asking her to do, underneath the pleasant words, underneath fair conditions, was to go back into her bay and find a way to make the number lie. She said she'd look at it, because she was still, at that point, giving the process the benefit of the doubt. She still thought this was a misunderstanding between honest people. She walked out of his office and she felt the floor tilt a little, the way it does when you realize the ground under your career isn't quite where you thought it was. That was the first offense. Small, private, deniable, a man in a nice office asking a careful woman to be a little less careful. If she'd said yes, none of the rest would have happened. He was betting she'd say yes. Almost everyone does. She went back to her desk, and instead of revisiting the assumptions, she pulled the whole file. And this is where it stopped being about one bad test. Because the Vero wasn't one car. The Vero was a line. A whole family of vehicles built on the same platform, the same body structure, the same undergauged pillar, shared across every trim and every configuration coming off that line. The 312 wasn't a single failed unit. It was baked into the architecture of every Vero they were about to build. Tens of thousands of them. It wasn't one test that failed. It was one design that failed, printed out across an entire year of production. Nora sat with that for a long time. The scope of it. Not a defect, a decision. Somebody had chosen the thin steel, and the thin steel was going into all of them. And here's the thing you have to understand about how Nora worked, because it's the whole story. She was, by nature, a person who kept records. Not because she was suspicious, not because she was building a case. She just kept them. For 14 years, every validation email she sent or received, she archived to the compliance shared drive. Every report, every objection, every reply. It was just how she filed. Belt and suspenders. If somebody asked her 2 years later why a test came out a certain way, she wanted to be able to open the folder and show them. She never thought about it as a weapon. She'd have laughed if you'd called it that. That's just how I file, she told Sam once when he teased her about it. I never really thought about it. Remember that folder? 14 years of email, sitting quietly on a company drive, filed by a woman who never once imagined she'd need it. That folder is the whole back half of this video. They forgot it was there. She almost forgot it was there. It was there. The Vero had a design review coming, the formal meeting where the engineering team signs off, or doesn't, on shipping the thing. Nora walked in with her 312 and her structural analysis and every intention of stopping the launch cold. This was the process. This was the exact moment the process was built for. You bring the failure to the table, in front of everyone, and the table does the right thing. Her manager ran that meeting. Marcus Deal. Now, I have to tell you about Marcus, because Marcus is where this story stops being about a company and starts being about a person. Whitfield was the villain. Whitfield was a suit doing what suits do. But Marcus was Nora's boss, and she'd thought something close to her friend. 48 years old, 20-something years at the company. They'd covered for each other on bad days. He'd come to Lucy's middle school science fair, back when Lucy still let her mom's co-workers come to things. Marcus knew Nora was right about the number. Marcus knew engineering. There was no version of Marcus Deal that looked at 312 millimeters and didn't understand exactly what it meant. He was 22 months from retirement. 22 months from a full pension he'd spent a lifetime earning. And that number, 22, turned out to weigh more than 312. In the design review, Nora laid it all out. The test, the intrusion, the undergauged pillar, the fact that it was the whole line. She was clear, and she was calm, and she was completely correct, and she watched Marcus's face while she did it, and she saw the moment he decided. He didn't fight her on the engineering. He couldn't. Instead, he used a phrase, a smooth, corporate, preloaded phrase, and he said it like it was a normal thing to say in a room full of engineers. I think we accept the residual risk and proceed. Accept the residual risk. Say it fast, and it sounds like a decision. Say it slow, and it means we know the car can kill the driver, and we're going to ship it anyway, and we're going to use grown-up language so nobody has to feel it. There was one other engineer in that room who understood exactly what had just happened. Nora saw him understand it. She saw him look down at his notepad and go still, the same stillness Sam had in the bay, and she waited for him to say something, anything, and he said nothing. He had a family. He had a mortgage. He had a very good reason to study the grain of the table. And Nora learned something in that silence that she'd spend the next year understanding. That being right, all by itself, doesn't make a single other person open their mouth. She went home that night. And this is the part I most want you to hear, because this is the part that made her unbearable later. She did not let it go, and she did not stay quiet, and she did not just complain to Sam over coffee. She sat down at her kitchen table, and she wrote a formal objection. In writing, she laid out the test result, the 312, the survival threshold, the shared platform, all of it. And she wrote one sentence I want you to remember, because it comes back. This configuration will not protect a belted occupant in a 32-kilometer-per-hour pole impact. Plain, unmistakable, no hedging. And she didn't just email it to Marcus. She copied compliance. She put it into the system, time-stamped, dated, on the record, so that no one, not Marcus, not Whitfield, not a lawyer 3 years later, could ever stand up and say nobody warned us. She warned them. In writing. On the record. That objection went into the compliance drive, into the same 14-year folder, and it sat there like a lit match in a dry room. They ignored it. Of course they ignored it. But you can't unsend a time-stamped warning. She just planted the single most important sentence of her entire career. And she'd done it the boring way, the careful way, the way that would matter more than anything when the boring, careful record was the only thing left standing. A few days later, she opened the official test report, the one that would go into the file as the record of what the Vero did in the side pole test. And she stared at it, because her 312 was gone. Someone had adjusted it. Her number, the folded pillar, the 62 millimeters past death, rewritten, on paper, in the official record, the Vero passed the side pole test. Clean, A pass. As if the pillar had held, as if Sam had never watched it fold, as if she'd never written a word. She stood at her desk, and she felt something cold move through her that wasn't fear exactly. It was worse than fear. It was clarity. This wasn't a disagreement about assumptions. This was fraud. Someone had taken a life safety failure and typed over it, and put the false number into the record that regulators and courts and grieving families would one day rely on. She emailed Whitfield directly. She kept it short. She asked him, plainly, why the validated intrusion figure had been altered in the official report. And Grant Whitfield, 55 years old, silver-haired, 2 steps from chief operating officer, a man so certain of his own safety that he did the one thing a careful criminal never does, he answered her in writing. 5 words. He typed them into an email on the company system, and he hit send. Numbers are a negotiation, Nora. Read that again. Numbers are a negotiation. He put it in an email. He was so sure that she was powerless, so sure that a lone validation engineer was nothing, a piece of furniture, a problem that HR could make disappear, that he handed her a signed confession and never gave it a second thought. Arrogance leaves things in writing. Write that down, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. He thought he was ending her. He was actually loading the gun she'd fire 18 months later. That email went into the folder too. Of course it did. That's just how she filed. 2 days after Whitfield sent it, they walked her out. They did it at the worst possible time of day, on purpose, when the floor was full. Security came to her desk, not a knock on a manager's door, not a quiet conversation in a conference room, but 2 men in uniforms standing over her cubicle in the middle of the afternoon so that everyone could see. Her badge was already deactivated. She found that out when Buckle knocked against the reader on her way back from the break room, and the light stayed red. They'd killed her access before they'd even told her she was fired. That's how you do it when you want to make a point. They gave her a cardboard box. She put in her things. A coffee mug. A dead succulent she'd never managed to keep alive. A framed photo of Lucy at 9, gap-toothed, holding a science fair ribbon. 14 years, and it fit in one box with room to spare. And then they walked her across the open floor. The whole length of it, past 40 of her co-workers, people she'd trained, people she'd covered for, people who'd eaten lunch at her table for a decade. And not one of them looked up. Every single one of them found something urgent on their monitor, some spreadsheet that suddenly needed all their attention. Because to look up was to see it, and to see it was to have to feel something about it, and it was safer to just let her walk. 40 people. 40 pairs of eyes on their desks. She did not cry. I need you to know that. She walked with her back straight and the box on her hip, and the only thing she did, the only crack in her, was reach up with one hand and close her fingers around the little plastic dummy on her lanyard. Buckle. She held on to Buckle all the way across that floor, the way you hold on to the one true thing in a room full of cowards. And as she reached the doors, Whitfield's voice, not to her, just carrying, the way a boss's voice carries when he wants a floor to hear it, said something about how the company thanked her for her service and wished her well in her future endeavors. Future endeavors. Over the heads of 40 people who wouldn't look up. That was the sound she walked out on. 40 witnesses. Remember that count. 40 people watched an honest engineer get marched out for refusing to sign a lie. This story does not end until every one of those 40 gets to watch something else. Keep counting. Then the doors closed behind her, and Nora Calloway stood in the parking lot in the gray Michigan afternoon with a box on her hip and a dead plant and a plastic dummy in her fist, and she had no job, no references, and a 17-year-old at home with college tuition due. They thought that was the end of it. Here's what they actually did. They took a woman whose entire identity was the careful, patient, boring keeping of records, and they gave her nothing left to do but keep them. The fall came slow and quiet, the way these things do. Nobody in that industry ever tells you no to your face. They just stop returning the call. Nora put out her URSAM. 14 years, senior level, a track record any company should have fought over. And the calls went nowhere. An interview that felt great, and then silence. A recruiter who was thrilled on Monday and unreachable by Friday. She couldn't prove anything, but she knew, the way you know, that somewhere behind her a reference was being given in a certain tone of voice. A pause in the wrong place. She's very thorough, Saeed the right way. Thorough is a knife. They didn't have to blacklist her on paper. They just had to make sure the word disgruntled got there before her Ursum did. So the senior crash safety validation engineer who'd caught the Vero defect ended up inspecting forklifts, contract work, warehouse safety, walking concrete floors with a clipboard, checking hydraulic lines and backup alarms for $18 an hour and no benefits. Honest work. She never once acted like it was beneath her, because it wasn't. But she'd stand in a cold warehouse checking a forklift's load rating, and some part of her would think about the Vero line rolling out of Rundell by the thousands, and she'd have to put it down and keep walking. She picked up a night section at the community college too, adjunct, teaching intro engineering to kids working day jobs, one evening a week for almost nothing. She was good at it. The students loved her. It still didn't add up to what she'd made before. Not close. And Lucy's tuition was due. That was the thing that sat on Nora's chest at 2 in the morning. Her girl had gotten into a good program, worked for it, earned it, and Nora had spent 17 years promising her it would be there. Now Nora sat at the same kitchen table where she'd written her objection, with a calculator and a stack of bills, doing the math over and over, and the math kept not working. That's when the envelope came from Halcyon Meridian's HR department. It was a severance offer. They'd waited just long enough for her to get scared, long enough for the forklift checks and the tuition bills to do their work. $85,000. All she had to do was sign a release of all claims and a broad non-disclosure agreement. Take the money, sign the papers, promise never to talk, and go quietly away. $85,000. Sitting on the table next to the tuition bill she couldn't pay. I want you to feel how heavy that envelope was, because the people who sent it knew exactly how heavy it was. It wasn't a payment. It was a muzzle with a price tag, and they'd priced it precisely at the number a frightened single mother couldn't afford to refuse. Sign here, and Lucy goes to school, and the Vero keeps rolling, and the 312 stays buried forever. That was the trade. They were betting again that she'd take it. They'd bet that once already. They were very confident about how Nora Calloway could be bought. She didn't sign it. Not yet. She put it in a drawer, and she couldn't look at it, and she couldn't throw it away. And then, going back through her own archive, the 14-year folder, her copies of everything, trying to understand how deep this went, she found the thing that changed her from a wronged employee into something the company should have been terrified of. It was a finance memo. Old, from back when the Vero platform was still being costed out, before Nora was ever near the side pole test. She'd been copied on it once, a long time ago, one recipient among a dozen, for reasons that probably had to do with a signature line on a spec. She'd archived it without a thought, the way she archived everything. And now, she opened it, and she actually read it. It was a cost analysis. A curve. On one side, the cost of fixing the structural weakness in the Vero platform, reinforcing the pillar, putting the steel back, making the car survive the crash it was going to face. That number worked out to $47 per vehicle. $47. And on the other side of the curve, they'd put the projected cost of not fixing it, the estimated liability, the math on how much they expected to pay out in settlements to the families of the people the weak pillar would injure and kill, spread across the life of the model. And the memo, cold, clean, in a spreadsheet, with a recommendation at the bottom, concluded that the settlements were cheaper than the fix. Cheaper to let people die than to spend $47 a car. Do you understand what that document meant? It meant they never missed the danger. Nora had spent all this time thinking she'd caught a mistake, an oversight, a corner cut too far, a failure somebody would be grateful to have flagged. She hadn't caught a mistake. There was no mistake. They had sat in a room with a spreadsheet, and they had looked at $47 and they had looked at the projected number of dead and injured human beings, and they had run the arithmetic and chosen. Her 3v12 wasn't news to anyone upstairs. It was a line item they'd already accepted years before Sam ever fired the sled. She sat in her kitchen, and she read $47 over and over until the number stopped looking like money and started looking like the price of Renata Aldana's spine. Although she didn't know that name yet, she would. That memo went to the top of the folder, and Nora stopped being scared and got very, very quiet, which, if you knew her, was the more dangerous of the two. Because now she had a choice to make, and she was too smart to make it in a hurry. She had $85,000 in a drawer that would fix her whole life and silence her forever. And she had a folder that could put the whole thing in the light and blow up her whole life all over again. Take the money and let the Vero roll. Or torch the money and go to war with a company that had already proven it could poison her name from 3 states away. She did the thing that made her Nora. She went and talked to somebody who knew the law. She sat across a desk from an attorney with the memo and the emails and the whole ugly shape of it, and she asked the question that had been eating her. If I take their money and sign their ENDA, is that it? Am I bought? Can I never speak? And the lawyer told her something she did not know, and that most people watching this right now don't know either. And it's the one piece of this whole story I most want you to walk away carrying, because it might matter to someone you love someday. A non-disclosure agreement, no matter how broad, no matter how much money they paid you, cannot legally bar you from reporting a safety defect to the federal regulator. It just can't. You can sign their paper. You can take their $85,000. And you can still, lawfully, walk into the federal auto safety regulator and hand them everything. An ENDA that tries to silence a safety disclosure isn't ironclad. On that point, it's worth about as much as the paper. And it got better. Because Nora had worried, quietly, whether her copies even counted, whether a company could say she'd stolen proprietary data. The lawyer explained that she'd been a legitimate recipient of every one of those emails. They were sent to her, in the course of her job, over 14 years. But the truly beautiful part, the part that made Nora set down her coffee, she didn't even need her copies to be the evidence. If the regulator opened an investigation, the regulator could subpoena the originals from the company's own servers. The exact same emails pulled out of Halcyon Meridian's own systems by federal authority with the provenance clean and unarguable. Her copies didn't have to be the weapon. Her copies only had to be the map. She could point, and the government could go pull the emails out of the very building she'd been marched out of. And Grant Whitfield's numbers or a negotiation would come out of his own company's servers with a federal seal on it. She sat with that for a long moment. The trap they'd built, the poisoned references, the muzzle money, the rewritten report. Every wall of it had a door in it she hadn't known was there. She could take the $85,000 and send Lucy to school, and she could still bring the whole thing down. Both, lawfully, at the same time. She still didn't move right away. That's who she was. She sat with it, and she checked it, and she made sure. And while she was sitting with it, the human clock caught up to her. It was a local news blip, the kind of thing everybody scrolls past. A single vehicle plus fixed object crash on I-75, a Vero, a side impact. The car had gone sideways into a barrier support at highway speed. And the passenger, a 16-year-old girl named Renata Aldana, had survived. Barely, with injuries the story described in that careful, gentle way local news does, the way that tells you it's bad, without telling you how bad. Nora read it 3 times. And she didn't need the details, because she already had them. She'd measured them. She had watched them happen in slow motion in her bay, months before, on a dummy, at 32 kilometers an hour. The pillar folds, it comes into the chest, 312 millimeters. Renata Aldana, 16 years old, was the number. The number had a name now, and a family, and a hospital room, and everyone else in the world had scrolled right past her. Everyone except the one person on Earth who had written down, in advance, exactly what that car was going to do to her, and who had been walked out of the building for it. Nora stood in her kitchen with her phone in her hand and the little news photo of a crushed silver Vero on the screen, and something in her went from cold to still to certain. No more sitting with it. No more making sure. She was already sure. She'd been sure since the sled fired the first time. 341 days after they walked her across that floor, Nora Calloway sat down at her kitchen table. She took the severance agreement out of the drawer, and, on her lawyer's advice with her eyes wide open, she signed it. She took their $85,000 because Lucy was going to college and because the law said the money bought them nothing they thought it bought. She signed her name, and she felt them think they'd won. Then, she picked up the folder. 14 years of email. Whitfield's 5 words. The $47 memo that priced the dead. Her own time-stamped warning, this configuration will not protect a belted occupant. And Sam Ree's rig log, the honest record of the honest test, which Sam had kept, quietly, all this time, because Sam had wanted, more than he wanted to be safe, to have done his job right. She put it all in a bag. She unclipped buckle from the old lanyard in the drawer, and she set the little dummy on the table where she could see it. And that same week, she got in her car, and she drove, not back to Rundle, not to the building. She was never going back to that building. She drove to the field office of the Federal Auto Safety Regulator, and she asked to speak to someone in defect investigations. They sent out a woman named Dolores Kim. Nora set the bag on the table between them. And she said, "My name is Nora Calloway. I was a senior validation engineer at Halcyon Meridian. There's a car on the road right now that they know will kill the person driving it. I have the test. I have the numbers they changed. And I have the emails." Dolores Kim did not react the way Nora expected. She did not gasp. She did not lean forward. She opened the bag, and she took out the folder, and she began to read. She read for a long time. The office was quiet. A clock ticked somewhere. When she finally looked up, her face had not changed, but her voice had. "You archived all of this yourself," she said, "for 14 years. "That's just how I filed," Nora said. "I never thought about it as anything else." "You understand," Kim said, "that we don't need your copies to be admissible. Your copies are a map. If what you're telling me is true, I can pull the originals from Halcyon Meridian's own servers, from their own hands. And then nobody can say you doctored anything." "I know," Nora said. "That's why I'm here. I don't need you to believe me. I need you to subpoena them." Kim wrote something down. Then she asked the question that mattered. "Walk me through the number." 312. "Tell me what it means." So Nora told her. She told her about the side pole test, about the sled and the rig and the dummy in the driver's seat, about the pillar that was supposed to hold and did not hold. 250 millimeters was the line. 250 was the most a pillar could fold into that space and still leave a person room to live. The Vero folded to 312, 62 millimeters past the line, 62 millimeters into the space where a driver's chest goes. "And the fix?" Kim asked. $47 a car, Nora said. "A heavier gauge pillar." $47. Kim wrote that down too. "They knew the number?" "They ran the math on the number," Nora said. "That's the memo. That's the one at the back. They didn't miss it. They priced it. They weighed $47 a car against what it would cost to settle the lawsuits. And $47 lost." Kim closed the folder. "I'm opening an investigation," she said. "It goes under seal. That means you don't talk about it. Not to a reporter, not to a friend, not to anyone. If this leaks, the company gets to say we're a witch hunt, and they get to move the evidence before I can reach it. Can you sit on this?" "I've been sitting on it for 11 months, Nora said. "I can sit on it a little longer." She drove home. She did not feel triumphant. She felt like a woman who had set down something very heavy and could not yet remember how to stand up straight, Lucy was at the kitchen table when she came in, homework spread out, earbuds in. She pulled one out. "You okay, Mom?" "I'm okay," Nora said. And for once, she almost meant it. The seal held. That was the strange part. For weeks, then months, the world went on as if nothing had cracked open beneath it. Nora inspected forklifts in a warehouse out by the county line, walking the aisles with a clipboard, checking hydraulic lines and mass chains for $18 an hour. She taught a night section at the community college, a room of tired people who wanted to be engineers, and she taught them the thing nobody had taught her gently enough: that the data does not protect you, that you have to protect the data, that someone will always want the number to say something it does not say. And all that time, the investigation moved in the dark. She testified twice more. She sat in a small room with Dolores Kim and a lawyer from the Regulators Council, and she walked them through it again. Slower, deeper, she drew the pillar on a whiteboard. She showed them where the gauge dropped. She read them Sam Ree's rig log, the honest record, the timestamps that matched hers to the minute. She read them her own written objection, the one she'd sent the night of the design review. This configuration will not protect a belted occupant in a 32-kilometer-per-hour pole impact. Sent, timestamped, CC'd to compliance. Ignored. You warned them in writing, Kim said. Before any of this. I warned them the day it happened, Nora said. I did everything right. That's what nobody believes. I didn't sneak out a back door. I stood in the front of the room and I said no, and I put it in writing, and they walked me out anyway. Kim looked at her a moment. That's going to matter more than you think, she said. Meanwhile, in the world above the seal, Grant Whitfield was winning. The Vero was selling. It was the company's best launch in a decade, small and cheap and clever looking. Tens of thousands of them rolling off the line and out onto the highways. And Whitfield's name was in the trade press. Halcyon Meridian's board had a new opening at the top, and the man they were talking about, the man whose photograph ran beside the words "Next Chief Operating Officer," was the man who had slid a report back across a desk with a failing number rewritten as a pass. Nora saw the article on her phone in the warehouse break room. She read it standing up, a paper cup of bad coffee going cold in her hand. Whitfield in a good suit, arms crossed, smiling the smile of a man who has never once been told no by anyone who could make it stick. She did not throw the phone. She did not curse. She just thought, quietly, all right. And she went back out to the floor to check the next forklift. That was the irony of it, and she felt the whole weight of it every day. She knew. She knew what was coming, and he did not. He was picking out an office, and she was checking mass chains. And the thing that would end him was already inside his own servers, exactly where it had been for 14 years, waiting for a subpoena. Then the company smelled it. It came as a letter. It came the way these things always come, on heavy paper, from a firm with 4 names, and it did not accuse her of anything true. It accused her of theft. Nora Calloway, it said, had removed proprietary and confidential company data in violation of her non-disclosure agreement, and Halcyon Meridian demanded its immediate return and reserved all rights. And she was to cease and desist any use or disclosure of said materials at once. She read it at the kitchen table, with Buckle sitting there watching her, the little plastic dummy, arms out, permanently braced for impact. And for one bad hour, she was afraid. She was 41 years old, and she had $85,000 that a company was now saying she'd stolen her way toward. And she had a daughter starting college, and a room full of night students, and $18 an hour, and a letter from 4 lawyers on her table. She had done everything right, and it might not be enough. That was the fear. She'd been so sure the truth would be a shield. Maybe it was only ever a target. She called her lawyer. She read him the letter over the phone, line by line. He was quiet when she finished. Then he laughed. Not cruelly. He laughed the way a man laughs when the other side has made a mistake they don't know they've made yet. "Nora," he said, "do you understand what they just did?" They're going to sue me. They just put in writing that they think you have their documents, he said, which means those documents exist, which means they're on their servers. And here's the part they forgot, or hoped you forgot. An ENDA cannot bar you from reporting a safety defect to a federal regulator. It's not a gray area. It's black-letter law. That agreement can gag you about 100 things. It cannot gag you about this one. And you didn't steal anything. You were a legitimate recipient of every one of those emails. You were on the distribution list. You archived your own work. But it doesn't even matter, because the regulator isn't using your copies. They're subpoenaing the originals. From Halcyon Meridian. This letter? She could hear him tap it. This letter is them trying to scare a woman they think is alone. Let them. It changes nothing. You're sure, she said. I'm sure, he said. Sit tight. Kim's about to move. And Kim moved. The subpoena went to Halcyon Meridian directly to the General Counsel's office on federal letterhead, and it did not ask. It required. It required the production of the complete email records, the original test data, the design review documentation, and the finance department's cost analyses relating to the Vero side structure, from a date 14 years back to the present. It required the originals. The metadata. The chain intact. They could not doctor it this time. They could not slide a number back across a desk. The regulator would pull the files from the company's own machines, and every timestamp, every sender, every recipient, every word Grant Whitfield had ever typed about the Vero would come out of the same servers where it had lived, untouched, since the day it was written. The emails came back exactly where Nora had filed them for 14 years. And when they came back, the seal broke, because a federal defect investigation of a car with tens of thousands of units on the road cannot stay quiet forever. It went public. And the public version was ugly, and for a while, it was aimed at her. Halcyon Meridian's press people were good at their jobs. They did not defend the pillar. They could not. So they did the other thing. They made it about her. A statement went out. A disgruntled former employee, terminated for performance, was now pursuing a personal vendetta. And then the leak, placed carefully, the kind of leak that looks like journalism. She'd taken money, $85,000. She'd signed away all her claims and released the company and cashed the check. And now here she was crying safety. Bought and hypocritical. She took their money and stabbed them anyway. That was the story they told. It ran. People believed it. Nora read the comments once and never again. She was a bitter woman with a grudge and a payout. She'd sold her silence and then broken her word. Even people who should have known better nodded along, because it had a shape they recognized, and the truth had a shape nobody wanted to think about, which was that a company had done arithmetic on a child's chest. And then they reached for Marcus. She heard it from Sam, who still texted her sometimes, carefully, from a personal phone. They were leaning on Marcus' deal. Marcus, her manager. Marcus, 48 years old, 22 months from the retirement he had bent his whole spine to protect. They needed someone from the inside to say Nora had made the numbers up, that she was unstable, that the 312 was hers and not the car's. And Marcus was the one who'd signed the falsified report. Marcus had the most to lose and the most reason to lie. If Marcus said she fabricated it, the company had a story. That was the lowest point. That week, Nora sat at her kitchen table with the letter and the leaked article and the text from Sam, and she looked at Buckle. And she thought that maybe doing everything right just meant you got to lose slowly and with your eyes open. Lucy found her there at midnight. "They're lying about you," Lucy said. She'd seen it online. Of course she'd seen it. Everybody's saying you took the money. "I did take the money," Nora said. "But..." "Sit down," Nora said. And she told her daughter the whole of it. The law, the loophole, the reason she could take $85,000 and still walk into a federal office and hand over every page. That the money bought them nothing. that she'd taken it precisely because it bought them nothing, and Lucy was going to college, and the truth was going out either way. "They think the check makes me a liar," she said. "It's going to turn into the thing that proves I'm not." "Watch, how do you know?" "Because I read the statute," Nora said, "and because your grandmother didn't raise me to bluff." The deposition room was small and beige, and it had a long table and a court reporter in the corner and a screen on the wall. Nora sat on one side. On the other sat two lawyers for Halcyon Meridian. And between them and beside Kim, on the screen, were the documents. The real ones. The subpoenaed ones. Pulled that week from the company's own servers. Dolores Kim did not raise her voice. She never did. She simply began to read the record into the record. "Marking Exhibit 14, Kim said. An email. Sender, Grant Whitfield, VP of Vehicle Safety Engineering. Recipient, Nora Calloway. Retrieved from Halcyon Meridian's mail server, under subpoena. Server-side timestamp intact. Message identifier intact. Subject line, Vero side pole. Body reads, quote, numbers are a negotiation. Nora, end quote. She let it sit in the room. She turned to the company's lawyers. Counsel, is there any dispute that this email was authored by Mr. Whitfield and pulled from your client's server? The lawyers looked at their notes. One of them started to say something about context. That's not what I asked, Kim said. Was it authored by Mr. Whitfield? Was it pulled from your server? Yes or no? The lawyer was quiet. Then he said, we have no basis to dispute the metadata. No, Kim said. You don't. Because it's yours. And that was the moment the whole thing turned, and Nora felt it turn. They had spent months saying she stole the documents, and now the documents were on a federal screen, and they had come out of the company's own machines, and the company's own lawyer had just said, on the record, that he had no basis to dispute a single one. Her copies had never mattered as evidence. They had only ever been a map. She'd said that in the first hour, in the field office. She never needed to steal anything. She only needed to point. Kim went through them one at a time. The falsified report, with the 312 rewritten as a pass, and beside it, from the same servers, Sam Ree's rig log, unaltered, showing the true number. Her own written objection, timestamped the night of the review. The $47 memo. Each one read in, each one authenticated, each one impossible to wave away, because each one had come from them. The company's lawyers stopped objecting somewhere around the 9th exhibit. There was nothing to object to. You cannot object to your own mail. Then Nora's lawyer took his turn, and he reached for the one weapon they thought was theirs. The money. You've told the public my client took $85,000 and released her claims, he said. You've suggested that makes her disclosure improper. I'd like to read the relevant law into the record. He read it. He read the statute slowly, the way you read something to a room full of people who are about to understand that they built their whole defense on sand. A pre-dispute agreement, he read, that waives or purports to waive an employee's right to report a safety defect to the federal regulator, or that conditions severance on such a waiver, is void as against public policy. Void. He read the word twice. Void, he said. Not weakened. Not arguable. Void. The $85,000 did not buy my client's silence, because her silence on this subject was never hers to sell and never yours to buy. That clause was unenforceable the moment it was drafted. So when your client wrote her a check and thought it purchased her cooperation, your client was mistaken about the law. My client was not. She took money she was legally entitled to keep, and she reported a defect she was legally entitled to report. And there is no contradiction between those two things, except the one your press office invented. He set the paper down. And I'd note for the record, he said, that before she ever came to this agency, my client raised her concern internally, in writing, on the day of the test. She used the design review channel. She filed a formal objection. She copied compliance. She did every single thing your own process asks an engineer to do. And your client walked her across the floor anyway. She didn't run to the regulator. She was driven there. By you. The court reporter's keys clicked and then stopped. The room was very quiet. One of the company's lawyers took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, and Nora understood that she was watching a man realize his client had lied to him. Marcus came apart in a different room, a week later, at a hearing table, under oath. Nora was there. She sat where witnesses sit, and she watched her old manager take the seat and swear the oath, and she saw that he had aged. 22 months from retirement, and he looked 10 years older than the last time she'd seen him. The day he overrode her in the review and accepted residual risk and would not meet her eyes. He would not meet her eyes now either. The regulator's counsel put the falsified report in front of him. His signature was on it. They put his liability in front of him too, quietly, the way you show a man the edge of the cliff without touching him. Fraud, falsification of federal safety documentation, personal exposure, not the company's. His, Mr. Deal, the counsel said. Did you believe, when you signed this report, that the Vero side structure had passed the side pole test? Marcus was quiet for a long time. Mr. Deal, no, Marcus said. The word was small. It fell into the room, and it did not stop falling. You knew it had failed. I knew the test showed 312 millimeters, Marcus said. His voice cracked on the number. I knew what that meant. Miss Calloway told me what it meant. She told everyone what it meant. She was right. She was always right about these things. He stopped. That was the whole problem with her. She was never wrong. Then why did you sign it? Because I was told to, Marcus said. By whom? And here it was. The betrayer's own choice, made to save himself, and no one made it for him. Nora watched him choose. She watched him decide that his own skin was worth more than the lie he'd been protecting, and she felt no triumph. Only a kind of tiredness, because she had known this man for years and had once thought he was better than this. Grant Whitfield, Marcus said. The instruction came from Whitfield. He said the launch date was fixed, and the number needed to fit the launch date. He said, Marcus swallowed. He said numbers are a negotiation. He said it to me too. Not just to her. To me. And when you were asked, recently, to state that Miss Calloway had fabricated the data, what did you decide? Marcus looked down at the table. He still would not look at her. I decided I wasn't going to prison for him, he said. She didn't fabricate anything. The 312 was real. It was always real. I'm the one who signed my name to a lie, not her. He said it, and then his shoulders dropped, and he was just a frightened man who had run out of road. Nora looked at him and she thought, 22 months. He had sold his spine for 22 months and a pension, and in the end he'd handed it all back at a table to save himself from something worse. She did not hate him. That surprised her. She just saw him clearly, maybe for the first time. Whitfield fell last, and he fell in public, in the arena that had watched her walk out. It was a press briefing, technically, but everyone knew what it was. The regulator announced its findings, and behind the podium, on a screen large enough for every camera in the room to catch it, they put the memo. The $47 memo. The cost curve. The line that weighed a structural fix against projected settlement liability and chose the settlements. $47 a car on one side, the lives on the other. Priced in a spreadsheet, with a recommendation at the bottom. They read it out for the cameras. They said the words cost-benefit and projected fatalities in the same breath, and the room of reporters went very still, the way rooms do when something stops being a business story and becomes something else. And then the number that mattered to the public. The recall. 214,000 Veros. Every one on the road called back because the pillar that held them was undergauged to save $47. And the company had known and had done the math and had shipped them anyway. Grant Whitfield was not at the podium. Of course he wasn't. But his name was. The board's statement was brief and cold, the way these statements are when a company is cutting a man loose to save itself. The previously announced appointment of Mr. Whitfield as Chief Operating Officer had been rescinded. Mr. Whitfield was no longer with the company. His conduct had been referred for civil action and to the appropriate authorities for review of possible criminal charges. Nora watched it on a laptop in her kitchen, with Lucy beside her and Buckle on the table. She did not cheer. She watched the man's name come apart on a screen in the same industry that had watched her clutch a plastic keychain and walk across an open floor while 40 people found reasons to look at their desks. And she thought about those 40 people. She wondered how many of them were watching this too. The good came back into the record alongside the fall, and that mattered to her more than the fall did. Sam Rhee was named. Sam, 29, junior test technician, who had physically run the failed test and had been so afraid of ending up like her, blacklisted, unhireable, done at 29. Sam had kept his rig log anyway. The honest record of the honest test, saved quietly for over a year, because Sam had wanted, more than he'd wanted, to be safe. To have done his job right, his log corroborated everything, and instead of being blacklisted, Sam was named in the federal record as a corroborating witness whose documentation had helped confirm the defect. Vindicated, on the record. Safe, he texted her the day it came out. 3 words. You were right. And then a second text. Thank you for not naming me until I was ready. The Aldana family's case became the anchor exhibit. Renata Aldana, 16 years old, who had taken a side impact on I-75 and survived with exactly the injuries the failed test had predicted, the injuries the pillar was supposed to prevent, and did not. Her parents, who had scrolled past their own daughter as a local news blip, while the rest of the state scrolled past it too. Their case was no longer a blip. It was the human face on a federal finding. What had happened to Renata was no longer an accident. It was a foreseen and priced-out consequence, and the record said so. And then the regulator did the thing Nora had not let herself imagine. Dolores Kim called her. Not about the case. About the future. The agency was standing up a structural integrity working group, Kim said. People who understood what a pillar had to do and what happened when it didn't. People who knew how a validation engineer got overruled and what to build so it couldn't happen so easily again. Would Nora advise it? Nora said yes. The last time she sat at a hearing table, it was as an expert, not a witness. And she brought Buckle. She took the little crash test dummy out of her bag, and she set it on the table in front of her, arms out, braced. The way it had ridden on her badge lanyard for years, the way it had sat in a cardboard box on her lap, the way it had waited on her kitchen table through 11 months of silence. She set it down where everyone could see it. Someone asked her, near the end, if she had anything she wanted on the record. A closing statement. She thought about it. She thought about all the words she could say. And then she said the only ones that were true and short enough to matter. Mr. Whitfield told me numbers are a negotiation, she said. So I brought all of them. That was all. She did not embellish it. She let it sit, the way Kim had taught her to let things sit, and the court reporter typed it, and it went into the record, and it was done. 1 year later, the light is good in the mornings. The office is small. It's hers. A single independent safety consulting practice. 2 rooms above a hardware store in a town not far from Rundle, with a window that faces east so the light comes in golden and slow across the desk. There's a lamp on that desk, a plain one, and clipped to the neck of it, arms out, is Buckle. Still braced. Still ready. Lucy clipped it there herself, the day they moved the boxes in, and said, "He watches the door now, Mom," and he does. On a shelf above the filing cabinet sits Lucy's graduation cap, the tassel still on it. She's at college now, the $85,000 doing exactly what it was taken to do. She calls on Sundays. She's studying engineering. She told her mother she wants to work on the things that keep people alive, and Nora had to get off the phone for a minute after that one. On the corkboard by the door is a card. Handwritten, it came from the Aldana family, and it isn't long, and Nora doesn't read it out loud to anyone, but she reads it herself sometimes when a day is hard. Renata is walking. Renata is fine. The card says thank you for making it mean something. The clients come. Small companies mostly. Ones that want an outside engineer to tell them the truth before it costs them everything. Ones that have learned what happens to the ones who don't. Nora tells them the truth. It's the only product she sells. She learned a long time ago that it was the only one worth selling. She hears about the others sometimes. Not often. She doesn't go looking. Whitfield is deposed and unemployed, and by every account, still fighting it, still lawyering it, still trying to make the number mean something other than what it means. Someone who was in a room with him told her that when they pressed him on it, on the 312, he wouldn't say it. Couldn't. A whole year later, and the man still can't say the number out loud. Nora understood that better than she expected to. The number was the one thing he'd never been able to negotiate, and it had cost him everything, and it still would not leave his mouth. Marcus took early retirement. Quietly, he got the pension, in the end, or most of it, the pension he'd sold his spine to protect. And he lives on it somewhere quiet, and Nora hopes it's enough for him, because he's going to have a long time to sit with what he traded for it. 22 months. That was the whole price. She thinks about that sometimes, and then she stops thinking about it, because there's work to do. And here is the thing she knows now, the thing she'd tell the version of herself who ran that test twice, because she couldn't believe it. The data doesn't protect you. She was wrong about that, all those years. She believed the number would speak for itself. That process would shield the honest. And it doesn't. And it won't. The number was always going to speak. That part was true. 312 millimeters was always going to fold into someone's chest, whether anyone wrote it down or not. But it only got to speak because somebody kept it alive. Somebody archived it for 14 years without thinking about why. Somebody kept an honest rig log while scared to death. Somebody wrote it down the day it happened and then carried it. Through the firing and the poison and the $18 an hour and the 4-lawyer letter, long enough for one federal officer to read it into the record. The truth doesn't save itself. That's the whole lesson. You have to keep it alive long enough to be heard. The light moves across the desk. Buckle watches the door. And Nora Calloway, senior crash safety validation engineer, gets back to work. If you've ever been punished for refusing to do something wrong, comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one has traveled.